Welcome to our second Hope Ahead webinar, Axxess Prepares the Way. I'm your moderator, Raianne Melton, Director of Clinical Services for Axxess Professional Services. Here at Axxess, we are laser focused on ensuring our clients have a smooth transition from HIS to HOPE. In our first webinar, Checking Your Processes, we discussed the importance of reviewing your HIS submission processes and practice gaps now to identify and address areas of risk that might impede success with HOPE. Today, we will discuss the preparation and plan for Axxess's hospice solution to meet HOPE regulatory changes. Time permitting, we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. If we run out of time, questions will be answered via email. I'm pleased to introduce Amy Rose, Senior Director of Product at Axxess. Amy and her team started working on the design to accommodate the HOPE changes nearly 1 year ago. Welcome, Amy. I'm excited to turn it over to you for your overview of the brilliant work and thought going into our solution design for HOPE.
Thank you so much, Raianne. I appreciate everyone's time today and making time to go through our approach for HOPE together. We're going to be talking a lot about the topics that Raianne spoke about in her previous webinar, which is really how do we prepare our staff members for such a large regulatory change in the industry. So we'll start with a quick copyright notice and disclaimers. I do want everyone on this webinar to be aware that everything that we're going to see today, we're going to have a really nice look and feel of what the Axxess solution will look like come HOPE. However, everything that you're going to see today is subject to design adjustments. So give or take some design adjustments, it is intellectual property that you're going to be seeing today, and it is also copyrighted. So let's go over our objectives. We're going to be looking at Axxess Hospice's approach to the upcoming HOPE changes. We want to understand how Axxess is approaching this change so that you can go back to your organizations and assimilate that information and let your clinicians and operators know exactly how they can leverage our solution as we come up to the HOPE window, and then also when HOPE goes live, of course. We want you to be able to take away from this describing 2 tools that we're going to be putting in your hands to help ensure operational success. And then we're going to also look at some design of some new HOPE elements that we have coming up, which is really exciting. So as we know, HOPE is one of the largest regulatory changes that hospice has seen in about the last 15 years. When we really get down to the changes between the hospice item set and the HOPE update, there are 3 major buckets that we have been compounding these changes into. The first is the clinical changes. Of course, there are new clinical questions that need to be asked and answered that clinicians have never seen before. And then we also have changed items. We have items that were asked one way with the hospice item set and are now asked a new way with the HOPE changes. The 2 most significant changes that are happening with HOPE are the concept of the HOPE update visit, which of course needs to be completed between days 6 and 15 in care, and then 16 and 30 of care. And with that HOPE update visit is a requirement to ask and answer symptom impact questions. And if those symptom impact questions are scored at a higher level with the patient, then it requires that the clinician do a symptom follow-up within 48 hours. So we're going to talk a lot about those concepts today. Otherwise, with the new items that are changing with HOPE, the questions from a clinical perspective, when we got down and looked at the industry and talked to the industry, we're hearing clinicians saying, these are routine things I'm already asking within my assessments today. Now we are just asking them and capturing them to be submitted from a quality measure perspective. So from a clinical perspective, the largest changes really exist in the HOPE update visits and the symptom impact follow-up. From an operations changes, we did have some new administrative items that were introduced, and then we had some changed administrative items. A good example of a changed administrative item is the way that the hospice item set captured race information and the way that the HOPE requirements require both race and ethnicity. So there are some things there are very few things that are new from an operational perspective, several things that are changed. And then, of course, from an operational time point, it's one thing to have a clinician to go out and care for a patient and see them at these new time points and ask and answer these specific questions. But we also need operational tools for maybe clinical managers or regional operators to say, how are we doing by ensuring that our clinicians are going out and they're following these time points, and also following the symptom follow-up parameters of that 48-hour time frame. The technical changes associated with HOPE, as we know, is that we used to use the HART tool, or today we're using the HART tool to submit data to CMS, and they're going to be transitioning that to the AGILE system. If you are lucky enough to be connected with an organization who has multi-service lines, like Axxess is, we have multiple products that serve the care at home industry. We know that, for example, home health is already submitting data to AGILE in a very similar way that HOPE is going to be submitting data. So at Axxess, we've had the privilege of relying on tools and technology that we already have at our advantage, like with our home health program and their ability to submit pieces into AGILE, or at least download a file that can be submitted to AGILE in that way. As we've gone through our design approach for product, we wanted to take on the heart of early assimilation. We want for clinicians, with these new questions that are going to need to be asked and answered, we want to put in front of them the opportunity to start asking and answering those questions in their routine assessments. Axxess has always done a very good job about pointing out where there are HIS questions in a clinical assessment. We do so by leveraging a small green pill on the clinical assessment that shows the item number associated with that HIS question. With new HOPE questions, we are working to embed them into existing visits today so that when clinicians are completing their visit, they'll now see that question, they can start to ask and answer that question, and that question is called out with a small purple HOPE pill. These changes should be seen in the system over the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll get a good sneak peek of what those will look like here soon. We also know that there are going to be end-to-end visits, things like our admission visits, that need to have the adjustments necessary for HOPE. We're working to bring these into the solution in a protected way so that clinicians and operators can see what that visit looks like from end to end. We also have a pilot group who's working through these visits with us from end to end so that you can leverage that information and bring it back to your organizations or your clinicians in a way that's meaningful prior to HOPE Go Live. And then, like I mentioned in the previous slide, we want to make sure that there's support for operations. So we have some really cool things coming to the solution that will help you operationalize these new changes within your organization. From an early assimilation perspective, these are the questions that we are working to bring to the existing notes today that clinicians can start to ask and answer, that we felt not only were new, but will be meaningful in their routine processes today. We know that items A 1905 and 1910 ask about the living arrangements and availability of caregivers and assistants. We will see here in a couple of slides what that will look like in our visit. Death is imminent is already a question that we asked in many of our forms that existed at Axxess Hospice today. So we'll be simply calling that out to clinicians as a question that needs to be answered from a HOPE perspective. Neuropathic pain is another one that's going to be added to the pain assessment. And then we know we have the new M questions, which are skin conditions, types of skin conditions, and skin ulceration, injury, and what that treatment looks like. Now, it's important to remember, especially if you're listening to this and you're not a clinician, that as a clinician, these are things that I'm already looking at. I'm already asking these meaningful questions. And of course, Axxess Hospice, all of our notes already had an integumentary assessment, right? What we needed to do was bring those questions forward to the clinician in a way that is asked and answered in an appropriate way for HOPE. So you'll see as I move on through my next slides and we get into the visits, we're really anticipating that we want to call it out to the clinicians, but it's important in this time of change management, feeling like we have such a large regulatory change coming up ahead of us that many of these changes that HOPE already asks for are routine clinical care. We just need to be able to communicate to them that now it just has to be asked and answered and captured in a specific way for clinical quality measure purposes. Now, we've already talked a little bit about how we're going to be updating the visits themselves, but this is an important concept. The admission visits as they exist today are the RN initial visit and the RN initial comprehensive visit. And then we know if we're using the RN initial visit that the RN comprehensive is a visit that comes subsequently and captures HIS data. There's going to be new HOPE visits associated with all three of those admission types of visits. And like I said, our pilot team is working to get those and test them end to end, and then we'll be giving organizations access to those visits so that you can kind of look and see and feel how those admission visits exist today, or how they're going to exist when HOPE goes live. For HOPE update visits, we've taken a very unique and smart approach that leverages a lot of the Axxess intelligence mentality of automation throughout the flexible time period that is days 6 through 15 and 16 through 30. So at Axxess, we don't want you to think about the HOPE update visits as one singular visit. We do have the ability through all of our nursing visits during HOPE to capture all of the HOPE update visit information. Now, we also like to embrace control flexibility, so we will have some opportunities as an organization if you want your clinicians to ask your HUV questions in one visit, that you can require that they do that. However, we are going to leave that period of time to be flexible so that your HOPE update visit elements, things like your skin assessments and your is death imminent, those questions, those early assimilation questions that we saw before that are also incorporated into your HOPE update visits, those are going to be able to be asked and answered in any of your nursing visits. And then, like I've said several times before, we're going to give you some operational tools to make sense of having multiple points of visits culminating to one submission to CMS. Now, to some degree, we can't get away from that, right? Because we know we're going to have at least 2 visits in every window for HOPE. So in admission, if you have a patient that has symptoms impact that are severe, you're going to have a follow-up visit for those symptoms. The same is true in the HUV1 window, and the same is true in the HUV2 window. So as we move forward, work towards embracing the concept of those time periods being flexible and really relying on the Axxess technology to abstract that information from multiple visits and bring it forward to you in a way that's meaningful. And I'm hoping that this will all come together for you as we start to look at some of the visuals and mock-ups we have. From a discharge perspective for HOPE, there are very few changes that are happening on the discharge visit. So we don't anticipate any major changes. The biggest changes there from a technology perspective is that in your export center, when you're exporting that discharge type of record, of course, that is going to be going into the iKey system in such a way that is that can be calculated from that perspective. So let's get down to brass tacks. I'm really excited to show you some of these new form elements and what they're going to look like within visits. Here's a good example. This is your A1905 and 1910 questions about the availability of caregivers in the patient's home. You can see here I'm in an RN initial and comprehensive assessment, and under the supportive assistance tab, I have 2 new questions that also are labeled with that small purple HOPE pill. This is a great opportunity when this goes live in 6 to 8 weeks in the existing visits as they are today, to point out to your clinicians, or hopefully I have some clinicians on the call who will be savvy enough that when they're completing their documentation, they know what HOPE means, and they can say, okay, this is going to be a HOPE question that's going to have to be asked and answered when HOPE goes live. So with these 2 questions, of course, they're within the typical format that Axxess always has. There's a drop down, and those drop downs correlate to the responses required and appropriate for HOPE. The same is true for coding the in-person level of assistance. For demographics, we had an update to language. Now, again, this was a great example of how Axxess is already capturing this information in the edit patient profile, which is where we just moved to in this screenshot. We are already asking about the patient's preferred language. This is still going to be there, but now they have a HOPE pill to point that out. And we also added the additional question of, do you need or want an interpreter to communicate with a doctor or healthcare staff, which is a requirement of HOPE. Now, we know this particular information, though it lives in the edit profile, is meaningful to the clinician as they're documenting on a patient. So this information is also brought back into the assessment in the supportive assistance tab under cultural preferences. So this begs me to point out that as we went through HOPE design, the product team was very purposeful about looking for opportunities to streamline existing documentation. And I'm going to be able to show you that in a couple of slides here, how we've made several assessments much more streamlined from a clinical perspective. And in my from my perspective, I believe that we're going to be able to release our HOPE admission documents and actually potentially have the potential to reduce the amount of clinical burden and time that a clinician has to document against that visit, because in one instance, which is pain documentation, we have reduced 7 clicks from that current assessment and really just made it a lot more streamlined for the user. So moving on, in the patient history and diagnosis tab, we're seeing the prognosis changes. I had already pointed out that death is death imminent was already a question that was being asked and answered in this section of the visit. What we did is we moved that up to the top of the prognosis section so that it is more called out for the clinician. It now has that purple HOPE pill. And then we've also made the signs and symptoms of imminence of death a little bit more meaningful from a documentation perspective, so that there wasn't redundancy of what was already being asked and answered. The last piece, of course, is our skin conditions, and this will nest. For time purposes, we didn't include all of the nesting in this presentation, but this question will nest and ask you the subsequent questions and questions that are being added to the assessment. Now, what we've just seen is these questions being put into the existing RN initial comprehensive, but these concepts will flow over into all of the nursing assessments, because those are all also HUV questions. So they will also be introduced into the nursing assessments when this change goes live. Now, this is a little bit of a unique need, which is the existing HIS questions of scheduled opioid, PRN opioid, and bowel regimen. These are 3 questions that are already being asked and answered at the time point of admission. And for HOPE, that's not changing. We're still going to have to be asking and answering these at admission. So this is what this looks like in the visit for admissions. For HUV visits, however, we're having to ask and answer these questions again between days 6 and 15 and 16 and 30. So these questions will be added to those additional nursing notes beyond the admission notes. But this is nothing that is new to a clinician. These are questions they have seen for the last 15 years in his assessment on the admission forms. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to be showing you a prototype of what our new pain and symptom management documentation will look like. This will give you an idea of how we are handling the very important concept of symptom impact in your assessments. Now, I'm just waiting for my screen to catch up. Okay, here we are. Here we are in a patient's task list. I'm going to open up a skilled nursing visit, and in that skilled nursing visit, I now have a new section for symptoms, ratings, and impact. This is going to be an experience that's going to be consistent across all notes. And the very first thing that we're going to see is a pain assessment. So this is where we have minimized 7 clicks for a pain assessment. Historically, we rated pain and then we chose how that pain was assessed, and then we had some subsequent answers to this initial pain assessment. We've changed that logic so that a clinician can first answer, how are they assessing the pain? Let's assume I'm assessing my pain on a numeric scale. It's going to come up with the typical 0 to 10 scale that Axxess has used in their symptoms ratings. I can choose that symptom. Let's say I used a verbal descriptor, then it's going to bring a verbal descriptor scale up, and I can select the responses there. Wong-Baker already existed in our system, but now it's in a more meaningful place for a clinician if a patient is not needs a patient visual, or if a patient is nonverbal. We already had a pain ad that was built into the system, but it's easier to access from this viewpoint. So of course, those of you who are HIS savvy are going to recognize these responses as the responses required today for HIS. And those responses are not changing from a HOPE perspective, but what we saw was the opportunity to make it easier and more meaningful for the clinician to document against. This is also in subsequent visits where we're going to be able to categorize whether or not a symptom impact is a reassessment or whether it was a regular assessment that was completed within those first admission HEV1 or HEV2 windows. We will have smart logic that will help your clinicians make those determinations, as well as scrubbers that will show them whether or not that is an appropriate response. For example, we wouldn't allow for a reassessment to be completed if a regular assessment was not already completed. One of the things that we did in this design is recognize that we loved the way that Axxess Hospice already asked and answered symptom ratings questions. And we wanted to marry this new regulatory responsibility with the existing user experience and give them an elevated experience while also asking about the impact of anxiety. Now, as a clinician myself, I find this question of impact of symptoms to be very valuable. It's something that I always already asked my patients, but it was challenging always to say, I want the patient's subjective experience and I want to be able to measure that. That is the Axxess symptoms ratings as it exists today, where we're using a modified Edmonton's to be able to document on symptoms from a 0 to 10 scale. But beyond that, we now have a regulatory responsibility to ask, what is the impact of that subjective number? So what we've done in the Axxess design is to merge those two concepts together. So as I'm assessing my patient, I'm giving them a subjective number, and then I'm following up with my question about the impact of that symptom assessment. This is what is going to trigger if I have a symptom that is a moderate or severe. These require symptom follow-up if this is an initial assessment within the admission HEV1 or HEV2 window. So this assessment becomes very important. We also had some opportunities during this time period, if you think about this as an admission assessment, to make, is pain an active problem a more meaningful location, and did the screening for shortness of breath indicate that the patient had shortness of breath? Those are existing HIS questions that will also be put into this one meaningful symptom rating and impact experience. With that, I will be moving back over into my presentation. So give me just a moment. So how are we going to bring all of these pieces together in a meaningful way operationally? The first way that we're going to be doing this is through an innovative HOPE Center. The HOPE Center is going to live in the patient's chart, and it's going to be where you can toggle between tasks and the HOPE Center. This is a very drilled down view of how I'm doing within my time periods of HOPE. So am I within my period of admission? Am I within my period of HUB1, HUB2? During those periods, have I asked my symptom impact questions? If I have asked my symptom impact questions, are they completed? And do I have a reassessment required? And in that sense, if I have a reassessment required, has that been asked and answered? So this is a one-stop shop for you to see maybe a 10,000-foot view of where you are in your HOPE journey. This is also going to be the very powerful tool that we give to you that allows you to scrub against the information that you have within those HOPE windows, that shows you whether you have inconsistencies within your data or missing data during that time frame. So you can see here on my symptom tracker that I'm in my HUB1 window. I've completed a symptom impact screening, but I haven't assessed or reassessed my impact. So that would equate to the missing data that we see down below on the HUB1 window. If I click over on the right-hand side to view details, I'm going to get a very similar experience to those of you who are very well-versed in Axxess today, to the HIS manager, where we can see those forms that are going to be submitted to CMS. That experience is going to come to this screen and allow you to see the data that is collecting during that time period into that one CMS form that's going to be submitted. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive view of what this means for symptom ratings. As I said, as I was going through the prototype for symptoms ratings, the symptom ratings that Axxess has as an experience today is a beautiful experience, and that culminates to a very important screen called symptoms ratings. The new symptoms impact page, symptoms ratings and impact page, will show you not only the symptoms ratings as they always have, but also the impact of those symptoms. So being able to call out whether you have symptoms that are at that 2 or a 3 that are requiring reassessment, and the same symptom impact tracker that you saw on the HOPE Center is also available here. So let's talk about the HOPE Export Manager. In April, we will be releasing some updates to the HOPE Export Manager that improves the visibility when you have correction records. In the previous webinar that Raianne completed, we really talked about working through change management with your team and how important it is that we have processes that are right and tight today when it comes to HIS exporting, and making sure that we really have a handle on our processes of HIS today, and how if we put some time and attention and effort into ensuring that those processes are right and tight today, we're going to be more successful in go live time for HOPE. This is a change that we are embracing that same concept. We want to be able to bring out some of those more edge things, like when you have a correction to an HIS record today, that's not something hopefully that you're doing every single day, but we want for those pieces to be very clean and organized for you. And so bringing tools that help you do that in your organization, and of course will ultimately help us be more successful during HOPE, was the mindset there. Of course, in October, we're going to have a name change to the HIS and HOPE Export Manager, and that will be cutting over, or sorry, from the HIS export manager to the his/hope export manager. Now, we know one thing about CMS forms and the way that CMS is handling new patient admissions is that we're not going to have to live within a mixed environment for a very long time when we cut off to hope, because we know patients that are admitted with an HIS admission but are within an HUV window during the cutoff to hope, those HUV assessments will not be required. However, those patients will have a hope discharge record. So that is really the only scenario in which a patient will cut over from his to hope. Otherwise, once CMS releases this as go live, we will be looking at every new patient as a hope patient from beginning to end, requiring admission, HUV1, HUV2, and discharge. But again, if you admit a patient on HIS and then they discharge in the window of hope, their discharge record will actually also be a hope record, not an HIS record. So we will hold on to that naming convention for a little while, and eventually, you know, maybe a year down the line, the His and Hope Export Manager will simply become the Hope Export Manager. Also in this change, there will be a new pending assessment tab in that Hope Export Manager. This pending assessment tab, if you can think through operationalizing the Hope Center, it's great to have a drilled down view of how your patient is traversing Hope. However, you as operators and maybe regional operators also, or QA team members, need to have an expanded view across all of your patient population, and this pending assessment tab is going to bring that look and feel to you. And then you can, if you needed more details about what the pending assessment tab was telling you, it would lead you into the Hope Center where you can see the details of exactly what is missing or what needs to be completed for that patient during those windows of time. So I'm a little bit ahead of time, but I will pass it back on to Raianne. I think if we have time for Q&A, it seems like we have some time for any questions that may have been asked during my presentation. I'd be happy to take those questions on.
Thanks, Amy. We had one question. We had two questions, but I answered one about the slides. We won't be sending you a copy of the slides, but you will be receiving a copy of the videos of this video presentation. Also, there was a question about using the PAIN-AD in patients that do not have a dementia, and instead using staff observation, and how will that be documented, that reason? What's the recommendation when it's a non-dementia patient using that tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. As with all of our other assessments, there will be a section for comments at the bottom of your symptom assessment, so you can call that out in your symptom assessment as well, or in the comment symptom assessment.
Excellent. Well, that seems
a very meaningful question.
That is a great question. It looks like those are the only questions that we have now. I'm going to go ahead and start my wrap up. And if anyone, if any questions pop up, we'll just switch back over to those questions.
That sounds perfect.
Amy, what a great presentation. From early assimilation to support for operation, your team has thought of everything for success at Hope. And I for one, appreciate that really greatly. At Axxess, we understand hospice's educational and operational challenges while implementing regulatory changes. If you want to learn more, please plan to attend these upcoming events. On April 10th, join Amy, Greg Grabowski, Jennifer Kennedy, and me for part 3 of this series, Hope Ahead, Hope Ignited, where we're going to talk about some of the interesting stuff that we're going to be presenting at the Hope Workshop, which is, the Hope Workshop is the main event. It occurs on May 5th and is an in-person workshop at Axxess's Growth, Innovation, and Leadership Experience in Dallas. In this 3-hour workshop, facilitated by industry experts, expect to be educated, work through scenarios, and learn how to train staff efficiently. You will receive at the workshop significant takeaways that you can use in order to ensure that your staff is ready when HOPE goes live. Later this week, expect an email with this webinar recording. And in the email, there will be a link for registration for AGILE, including the HOPE workshop. I also would like to point out that, don't hesitate to reach out to our training and certification site that also will have great information that you can't go without. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you at our next HOPE Ahead webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining Axxess On Demand. Visit axxess.com for more on-demand videos, industry resources, blogs, and answers to frequently asked questions. Axxess, empowering care anytime, anywhere.